because of things like Gnosticism, and people like Martian start putting out their own canon list of, well, these are the authoritative books. And these lists slowly develop into the church recognizing what becomes the 27 books of our New Testament.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Thinking Theological Podcast, the show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Dodge, and joined as always by the Master Resident Theologian in Training, Spencer Shaw. Spencer, how you doing?
Doing good. We're gonna try to make it through this episode without
Storm watch.
power going out. We've got storms going up all around. We already had that once before we got started. All around me, storms are going on. So we'll if you see this episode,
Saturday, we've got it.
At some point we made it through this recording. I don't know how long it took us, but
yeah, we Wednesday through Saturday we have just storms all week is what it looks like. So really excited for the prospect of that, but I'm fine right now. So if it doesn't work, then it's all your fault, and we'll have to carve out more time in the schedule. I hope everybody listening understands how, because as we're recording this, we're a little bit ahead of when it'll actually be posted, because we're trying to figure out how in the world are we going to get these episodes done. But we're committed to the conversations here. Before we get started on what this particular episode is about, a few things I want to remind you of. Number one, to check out our website, thinkingtheologically.org, and to go there and find all of our previous episodes, find various series and all of that as we get gradually more organized. We've got it's a canon of our own on the website. There we go. We're gradually putting those things together. We even have some lost episodes that maybe we could get back on there one of these days. But check out thinkingtheologically.org, because we have, in addition to the podcast, we also have some other written things like that. By the time you're listening to this, we've had our first bonus question with an interview that has gone up. Spencer, do you want to explain a little bit just what that is? You're the guy doing the interviews.
Yeah. So something that we're starting to do with the guests that we have on the podcast is to do a bonus question, or maybe even at sometimes kind of a bonus conversation that is kind of adjacent to whatever the bigger podcast topic was that we were able to speak about with the guest. And the way that that's structured right now is you can go onto the website and you will have the opportunity to become one of our paid subscribers. And being a paid subscriber gives you access to all of the bonus content that we'll do. There's even an entire page dedicated to bonus content that will continue to grow to who knows what all will end up being put on that page. But right now it's some of these bonus and extended conversations we have with some of the guests we have on the podcast. And the way that subscription is set up is it's a pay what you want. So you can pay $1 a month or $100 a month, or whatever you feel like the bonus content is worth to you. Feel free to choose that. But yeah, we don't want any of the content that we do to be limited to, well, you have to have money to be able to. We're not trying to do that, but it does go to help support. I don't know, doing a podcast isn't the cheapest thing to do, and we've got more ideas of ways that we would like to grow and more things that we'd like to do. And the unfortunate thing about the way that the world works is to do some of those things, it takes kind of money to have the ability to do them. So it just kind of helps us out with the time that we put into this, but also the stuff that we're trying to do, equipment that's needed, all of that fun stuff. So go check that out. And under our contents tab at the top is one of the drop down menus is bonus/subscriber content. And you can go and look at that. Right now it's a bonus question with Dr. Mark Goodacre from Duke. We talk about some of the trajectories in gospel studies that he's excited about. And you can go check that out. And hopefully here in the coming weeks, we'll have some additional bonus content, hopefully.
Aside from the content tab, we have a resources tab, and we just became affiliates with the Logos Bible software. And if you've never used it, Spencer and I both use it.
Mhm.
I've had it since my time at Bear Valley. Spencer's had it since his time in the various schoolings that he has done.
Well, I guess I kind of have it because of Bear Valley. Like you were the one that got me on it, and I purchased it before I started my
Am I
undergrad.
responsible for that too? So I
So,
taught you for a year or two in the youth group, and I got you onto Logos. So your scholarly trajectory is
well, it's more of my bank account going the opposite
oh, that's
trajectory
fair.
because of how
Okay.
much Lagos used to cost. It's a lot more
Yes,
affordable
it is.
with the
It
way that they
is.
have it set up now. But
And you can try it out for 60 days with the link. Normally, it's 30 days free. You can try it out for 2 months, so that's a lot of time as you're going through studying things to give you kind of a feel for, oh, this is how this thing works. So definitely check that out. That's under the resources tab on the website. So check that out. Be sure to follow us on Facebook to be notified when we post all of these things, the articles, the podcasts, the bonus episodes as those things go up. You can send emails to us at strongchurchministries@gmail.com and let us know what you think just about the show, maybe some upcoming things. You can send us messages and attack us personally if you would like. That's there. That's what that's all here for online. That's fine. We're used to it. You can get a hold of either of us on Facebook as well, and Spencer everywhere else on the internet. He'll be happy to field whatever you've got for him, but only negative criticism. He'll answer that right away. So please be sure to do that. I'm just giving you something to do this summer while
no, I have nothing better
you're
to
gonna
do.
get angry comments and you're gonna be gone for like a week and just come back to an inbox full
Yeah.
of of hatred somewhere. Thanks for listening with us today. Our subject for today is carrying on with what we've been doing for the last few. Last episode, we talked about why the books of the New Testament were written. Today, we're talking about how the books of the New Testament were chosen. We're going to get into a lot of history here. I used the word canon earlier. That's where we're going to start. Is what in the world is a well, okay, what is a canon from a literary standpoint? Because I immediately thought of Star Wars canon number 1, which is something that I can speak authoritatively to Star Wars canon.
Okay.
And then 2, I thought of the thing that they used on ships to blow up other ships. This isn't really either of those things. What is canon when we talk about the New Testament?
Yeah. So, like you said, a cannon is not something that is put on a pirate ship or used in the, I don't know, Civil War or whenever they used cannons. That's
A long
not what we're
time.
talking about. What we are
Yes.
talking about when it comes to the Bible and canon is actually close to something like Star Wars canon. It's used the same way in talking about Star Wars, but in this case, talking about religious, particularly Christian canon. So the books of the New Testament are technically called the New Testament canon. And so the process of choosing the 27 books that become the New Testament canon is a process called canonization. And those terms, canon, canonization, you may have heard before in a religious or a church context, or even outside of that in something like a Star Wars context. And where it comes from is the term canon literally means a reed or a rod, but it can also refer to a rule, a standard, a series, or a list. And in terms of Christianity, it came to refer to the rule of faith. And the image that I like to use is if you think about a ruler or a yardstick or something like that, and that can be referred to as a canon. It's a standard for measuring something. And so when it comes to faith, the question is, what is the standard? What is the measuring stick of faith? How do you measure, in essence, whether someone's a Christian, whether or not what they believe, what they teach is true and adheres to Christian Orthodox true teaching. And so you need some kind of standard, some kind of measuring stick to determine that. And the Bible is that measuring stick. And so when you refer to the biblical canon, Old Testament canon, New Testament canon, in essence, what it means is that these books are the measuring stick for Christian faith.
Yeah. So this particular conversation, I think, is interesting for a couple of reasons. Similar to looking at who wrote the Gospels, this is one of those the general. When I say general populace, within the church doesn't really think about these things. This is the Bible. These are the books. In the same way that we go, well, it says Mark, so Mark, but we don't really think about, okay, what is the process? What's the history behind books that are here? There were other books written. There were all kinds of books written, and so why these and not those, and how did all that come to be? The other part of this is there are people who think about it, but only have the surface level internet version of how this stuff came to be. And so there's what I have found a lot, especially in talking with Christians who are first exposed to this conversation, will go, I was exposed to this by a non-Christian atheist normally, who said this group came together at this time in the 300s or 400s, and they just said, well, we'll take these and we don't like those ones, and so here we go. And that's all she wrote. That's how it came to be. And there's actually a lot more going on with all of this. So if I had to guess, those that are listening to this fall into one of those two camps of like, I've never thought about it, interested to see what the history is, or I've had some conversations about this, and was it really just a council of some guys that said, I guess this is it. Here we go. Or was there more to it? So that's that's where we start. Canon here. How do we get the books here that as you said, the rule, they set the standard for how do we determine what it is we're supposed to do? How do we know when somebody is moving away from Christianity or all of this if we don't have some kind of foundational framework here? And so that's what we're talking about today. How did the New Testament books, not Old Testament, we're not dealing with that one today, but how did the New Testament books that we have come to be the New Testament canon? Process of collection is where we want to start first. How did all these things, these different letters, all this come together?
So one of the first things that we have to understand about the New Testament books, and this connects with what we talked about in the last episode about why the books of the New Testament were written and how they were produced. We talked about that a little bit. And one thing to emphasize about that conversation is that the authors of the New Testament, when they were sitting down and writing, they did not understand themselves as writing scripture. So when Paul's writing a letter to Corinth, what he's writing, he considers to be somewhat authoritative. And, because he kind of defends at times in his letters his apostleship and his authority. But the whole idea that all of these books would be gathered together and to be bound in this book that all Christians for all time would use is beyond the scope of what any of the New Testament authors could have imagined would have become of their work. And so we talked about their writing to, like Paul, to deal with specific issues that are going on in a particular church context. And we talked about, like with the Gospels, of also kind of a snowballing trajectory of continuing to think about and develop the understanding of who Jesus is, to continue to think about the implications of what Jesus did through his life, death, resurrection, and ascension. And so as that process is going, all of these different books of the New Testament get written. But over time, these documents are gathered into codices and circulated. And what I mean by a codices is a codex was in essence, an ancient book. And so I'm assuming a lot of our audience is aware that lot of ancient documents were written on a scroll, in a scroll form. And you can imagine these scrolls were large and bulky and heavy and not easy to carry around. It wasn't all that easy to find something in a scroll necessarily as well. And so the codex was invented, which was an ancient book. You had pages now that are stacked on top of each other and they're bound in some form or fashion. Now, most scholars who understand ancient writing do not believe that any of the books in the New Testament were originally written on a codex. The use of the codex among Christian communities was something that developed after the writing of the New Testament, or at least became prominent after the writing of the New Testament. Because from my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, but from my understanding of the use of the codex in the first century was it started out as something that you didn't write an important document on. It was kind of, you think of it as like a notepad or a scratch pad or something that you might keep detailed receipts. So you own a business and you're keeping track of receipts and things like that for your business. You might use a codex, but it wasn't something that you would write an important document on. And so it doesn't seem likely that the earliest Christian books or letters which were considered important would have been written on a codex. But as time goes on, what happens in these communities is they start to gather together these books based upon author or based upon themes. So the Gospels, similar types of work, they get gathered together in a collection, or the letters of Paul get gathered together in a collection. And one way to think about this is if you read through Paul's letters, we know that Paul expected that his letters would be copied and shared among other churches. So Paul had this understanding that I'm writing to Corinth, but Corinth is going to share this letter with Laodicea, and Laodicea is going to share their letter with Corinth. And so as this process began, churches began to have multiple books, so multiple letters of Paul. They began to have multiple gospels as the gospels were written. And so they began to collect these together. And the easiest way to copy and collect all of Paul's letters would be in a codex. And so Christians were kind of some of the first group that started to use a codex for important documents, which helps kind of lead the way into what becomes modern books. And so those are the first couple of stages. If you have these books that are written, they get copied and shared. And then as communities start to have multiple books of a particular kind or multiple letters from a particular author, these books get gathered together. Eventually they get gathered together in a codex because that is it is the easiest way to begin to gather these letters together. As this process happens, as these letters are circulated, as they begin to be collected, they start to become an important part of Christian liturgy or Christian worship. So when the church would gather together and to worship, these would be documents that would be important, on the one hand, to read out loud as a part of worship, but also they began to become important documents to guide how we worship. And you can just see that in Paul's letters. So Paul sends a letter, let's stay with Corinth. He sends a letter to Corinth, and that letter would be delivered and read out loud before the church, probably in one of their normal gatherings. Maybe not necessarily on a Sunday, but probably on something like that. So the church gathers together, it's read. So that happens from the very beginning. But particularly for the Corinthians, Paul addresses the way that they worship, how they take the Lord's Supper, how they use spiritual gifts, how they relate to outsiders who might come into their assembly. And so Paul's letter begins to guide the way that the Corinthian church worships. And that just continues to be the case and to grow and grow in significance as time goes on. And as this happens, these works begin to be translated because you have Christians in different places that speak different languages, and the common language changes from Greek to Latin. And so as time goes on, these works of the New Testament that were originally in Greek end up becoming translated into languages such as Latin or Syriac or Coptic or other languages that existed early on. And so the first thing to understand is kind of this process of how these books get collected together so that decisions can then be made about what is canon, what is the rule or the standard for determining what we believe and what we do as Christians.
I don't know that I have much to add about all of that. There are some things you said that I think matter more. Well, I'll say it here. Um, the which is just a wild thing to think about, of these individuals just writing things down. And yes, at least we know Paul has this expectation of these things being passed around as far as letters go. But being what they are today would not have been something they considered. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, penning the greatest work of all time is not really something they were thinking about. But the comment about their, or in Paul's case, he often defended his authority in various places. Second Corinthians has a lot of that, of defending himself and the authority that he has in all of this, which will become a factor later in what we're talking about as far as the collecting and what's regarded as in versus not, and all of those kinds of things, as well as some of the other things we talked about in previous episodes about just because the book is called by a certain title or has a certain name ascribed to it does not mean that that was the actual individual who wrote those things. So that all those previous episodes factor into what we're talking about here. And there were people then doing that work of trying to sort through all of that, like we have people now doing this textual criticism work and evaluating those things. Going right from the collecting all of this, where do we go from here? How does all of this develop as far as a canon is concerned?
Yeah, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to think kind of broadly about the history of development of these works being written, to them being collected, to them being recognized as canon or as authoritative, and kind of give some dates to this process. So the books were written maybe all in the first century. We talked a little bit in the last episode about how some of them might have been written in the first part of the second century. But, by, in my opinion, by, maybe 125 at the latest, everything is written. And so the first stage is the gradual initial collections, which we can think begin, I put the date here, 90, because Paul's works are all written in like the 40s and 50s. And so by the end of the first century, Paul's works are probably already being collected together. And maybe some of the early Gospels, maybe Mark and Matthew have been pulled together in some churches. So by the end of the first century, you start to get the beginnings of a collection. And these collections continue to grow, not only as the works continue to be written, but as they're copied and spread around. So between about 90 to 180, so the tail end of the second century, you have kind of the initial collecting or gathering together of these works, and things that would have been important were the words of Jesus, and so you get the Gospels gathered together. Important things would have been apostolic witnesses, so things that were connected to an apostle, whether or not the apostle actually wrote them, right? So that's where you get the letters of Paul, for example, being pulled together. After this, we get the gradual emergence of a canon. And so between about 180 to 220, so the end of the second century, the beginning of the third century, you get kind of the beginning stage of developing a canon. And we'll talk about how that looked here a little bit later in the episode. But something important to recognize is that it was the rise of heresies that serve as the key catalyst for developing a canon. And I want to explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. If you think about Christian communities, when the majority of Christians are believing the same kinds of things, practicing the same kinds of things, reading the same kinds of books, then there's not much of a need, if any, to develop a canon, some kind of standard for faith. Now, not all churches believed the same things or were reading the exact same books. There was a lot of diversity in the early church, and I want to make sure I say that, because a lot of people assume that, well, every church in every place early on looked exactly the same. And normally people say that to say they look exactly like my church today does, especially in our Church of Christ Restorationist. They all looked like 21st century churches of Christ. And that's just not the case. There was a lot of diversity. You even see it in the pages of the New Testament. There was a lot of diversity in practices. There was a lot of diversity in the ways of thinking about faith in God and Jesus. And we've talked before about one of the reasons is these beliefs developed. And so we've talked about the development of the Trinity that wasn't there early on. That was a belief that developed. Or even in the pages of the New Testament, the snowballing effect of the development of understanding Jesus' identity and connecting Jesus to God. And that was all things that developed over time. And so because of that, there's a lot of diversity amongst churches. But for the most part, most people who are calling themselves Christians are moving in the same general direction. What becomes the catalyst for needing to put together a canon is heresy. When major groups with a lot of influence show up and begin to teach heretical, false things and false practices, that becomes the catalyst for Christians to say, well, that's not true. And then to answer the question, well, what is? If that's not what we believe, then what do we believe? And what are the texts that are authoritative that guide our beliefs and practices? And so heresy becomes the catalyst. Particularly early on, there were two heresies. One was Gnosticism, which we've talked about before. It was kind of this appeal to special knowledge, and only certain people had the knowledge. It was a kind of like Platonism. It was a rejection of the physical world developed out of that. So you get to live however you want. That was an early catalyst in the 2nd century. Another catalyst was Marcion or Marcion, who he comes along, and Marcion in essence was anti-Semitic. He hated the Jews. He hated Judaism. And he believed in a God who was different in Jesus than the God of the Jews and completely got rid of all the Jewish stuff. And so he comes along and he has his own authoritative scriptures to support his position. It was the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul, all heavily edited. So for Marcion, he believed that Luke and Paul wrote it a way that completely rejected Judaism. But he had to edit those to edit out positive Jewish statements in Luke and Paul. So he had his own canon and his own teaching. And so he rejected all of the other books that become the New Testament. He rejected the entire Old Testament as well. And so what Christians did was, particularly with Marcion, they were like, that's wrong. That those books are not hold on. Okay. What happened there with Marcion and other Christians was that the other Christians said, well, what Marcion is teaching is wrong. That's not the canon. Those aren't the only books that are authoritative. We don't agree in editing out portions. We want the Old Testament, but also the teaching about Judaism. All that's wrong. And that kind of became the catalyst of, well, what is right? What are the right books? What is the right teaching about Judaism? And so Marcion in particular becomes a catalyst for Christians to start asking these questions and developing their own canon. And Marcion was, to our knowledge, the first person to put together some kind of fixed collection of books and saying these are the right books. And that was end of the 1st century, beginning to middle of the 2nd century that these things begin happening. So from the middle of the 3rd century onward, so we'll say 220 to 400, so between the end of the 3rd century all the way to the 5th century, We have public confirmation sought and established by the church, this gradual fixation of the canon. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. But people start putting out, because of things like Gnosticism, and people like Marcion start putting out their own canon list of, well, these are the authoritative books. And these lists slowly develop into the church recognizing what becomes the 27 books of our New Testament.
So, a couple things with this. First, this proving the definition of canon and showing why that's so necessary. There's this, well, that's not right. Okay, yeah, but what is? And so there has to be this defined mark of what we're trying to hit and all of this. And there's this understanding too of like, all right, well, here's Gnosticism and Marcion. What comes next? And so we're going to need to be prepared for more people doing these kinds of things. We need to have a fixed canon here of this is what it is. But this also shows something that, in what I was saying earlier, the non-Christian, the atheist that normally comes along, it's a generalized thing. But those that come along and say, oh, it was all decided by this council, the fact that there is pushback when Marcion comes along and starts saying, oh, it's that these books are out, these are in, but these sections aren't supposed to be a part of those books. And the fact that there's pushback to it shows that there's stuff circulating. There is stuff that is recognized as, yeah, no, these are the books that we've been reading and been looking at for a while now. You can't just come in and start throwing things away. So all of this stuff is starting to come together throughout all of this time. It wasn't just you had Jesus and you had the apostles, the prophets, all these individuals here, these writers, and then 400 years later they figured it out. It is an ongoing process the whole time, and these books that and we'll see this more specifically here in a moment. Uh, there are these books already with acceptance as much as they needed to think about accepting them. By the time somebody comes along to say, well, actually, I think it's these lists, they can get pushed back immediately and go, no, that's not it. We should probably figure out exactly, so that we don't have to worry about this problem anymore. So just something to think about if you're somebody, again, in those two camps that I was talking about. The service level never really thought about this. I mean, this is something they did think about, something they were doing for a long period of time here. In fact, it's the length of time that we're going to discuss next here real quick. Why? Oh, you jumped all the way into 400, 8400 here. Oh man, that's a long time. Why did this take so long? Why didn't they just deal with it quicker?
So one thing that might bother some people is that it took 400 years in essence for us to get a canon. And one of the things that I wanted to really push back against is the idea that these books were considered scripture from the very beginning. They just weren't. It was something that developed over time in the life of the church. And so there are several reasons about why this process took so long. One, which it may be kind of obvious, is just slow communication and transportation. So these books being copied by hand and circulating and being collected is something that takes time, right? There wasn't email, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't the printing press hadn't been invented. They didn't have computers to type on there wasn't a Xerox machine to copy the letters of Paul. So all of this took time. They had to be copied by hand. They had to go over transportation, which took time. There weren't cars or planes or anything like that.
There's a lot of cost too alongside
first,
that.
yeah, it's a time-consuming and expensive thing, and so it's going to take time for these things to be written and shared and collected. Another reason is persecution might have played a role in that early on, is that Christians were more concerned about how do we survive till tomorrow than they were about copying and sharing and developing a canon. And so they had some other concerns early on. The other thing, and to me this is the most important reason, is there wasn't a reason. Early on, as things were developing, as things were being written and shared and collected, as theology was developing, there before some of these major heresies, there wasn't a reason to do this. Like Marcion, who put together his first list, there now became a reason. And Gnostics started writing books in the 2nd century. And there becomes a reason now to collect authoritative works. But it took a while for that to become the case. And then once that became important, again, there's development of, okay, well, which books are there going to be? And that's where we're going to go to next. But for me, something important to understand is how these things develop. And here's there's some application there in that we in the church today sometimes have a habit of, well, this is what we've always believed. And because of that, it can't change. And there's an inherent problem with that, in that if the church has always believed something, I always say you have to have a very, very good reason to change it. But I think God intended for the church to develop and to change and to come to better understandings. And a prime example, and I know this gets thrown out a lot, but a prime example to me is slavery. Like a rejection of slavery just is not there early on. And I think that some of the foundational principles of love in the New Testament is what leads Christians in that direction.
Right.
But it takes a long time for Christians to come to an understanding of, well, to love my neighbor and to love my enemy and to see people as created in the image of God means we probably shouldn't hold them, other human beings, as property. That takes a long time to develop. And we can go all the way back to the Old Testament, and we just see that God allows things to develop. He doesn't just dump everything on us. And so conversations that churches are having about theology and things today, it's not a good argument to say, well, Christians haven't in the past, and so we can't. No, things are meant to progress. And the other thing just about the diversity is that I can't think of very much at all that there wasn't some group of Christians that believed at some point in history. Like there were Christians in history that rejected slavery. It was the minority opinion, granted, but it existed, and it took a while to, I guess, catch on. And there are plenty of examples about that throughout Christian history. But the developing process, I think, is important to recognize.
Yeah, even specifically with the slavery thing, even Philemon, that letter is not it's not a condemned practice. It's just being written of, no, hold on, remember. And you get the principle of loving God, loving others, all of this there with, yeah, you could by law do this, but under Christ you really ought to do these sorts of things. But even still, that's not a slavery's banned, guys. It's out of here. And all of this, same question that people have with, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand, same question people have with David, Solomon. They all had these multiple wives. What are we doing about that? Well, yeah, God's not instantly killing people every time that they step out of line, but no, that's also not his plan for those things. But there's a figuring out process to all of this. David does seem to figure it out with some consequences, but that there is this gradual thinking through these things and all of that. Here, that same thing is true with, I don't know. It's weird to think about. Because we come into Christianity and here's the book. For them, it's here's these guys and they're teaching us and we're listening to them every day in Acts 2 and onward. And then it's we're scattered and the Holy Spirit's guiding us as we go through this. I don't think the Holy Spirit is dumping all of the information at one time either. It is well, how do we figure this out? What do we do now? And then Paul will show up eventually and he'll help us a little more about what we should do.
And there are new, there's new things that the church has to address, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they put together a canon in the first place. And so, I mentioned something like slavery, but you think of questions today having to do with maybe some things related to social justice or women's roles or LGBTQ or whatever it may be. And these are questions that we have to have regardless of where you end up. But so many people I see write off all of those. If it's like, well, we've never believed that. And it's like, well, that might be true, and that's important to consider, but it's not a reason not to think about it and engage in conversation about it. And it's, even if, because there are plenty of things that I like, LGBTQ related things that I kind of land on the historic Christian position. I'm like, no, I think we've got it right throughout Christian history. But there are, other issues that I might be like, yeah, well, I'm not sure we've gotten that right. The majority of people have gotten that right. And maybe God is kind of leading us to continue to develop our thoughts and practices in this particular area or that particular area or whatever it may be. But we can't, the number of people that I see that just write something off as like, well, that's a new question. It's like, well, yeah, but
Right.
that's what we're supposed to be doing. Like the only reason we have the Bible is because of new questions over the course of 400 years.
LGBTQ issues and things like that I'm with you on that as well. I think we've had it right for all of this time. You still have to ask the question of, yeah, but how does that teaching apply in my context, even if it's this is what it is, but what's it look like?
We know a lot more about it, which is the other reason we have to talk about it, is because we understand the human beings a lot better than Paul did. I mean, we just do. The inner workings and psychology and biology of human beings, we have better knowledge about. So we have to ask, how does what Paul says apply in the world that we live in, where we understand these things a lot better?
Yeah.
And that's true for a lot of things. So we have to be willing to ask new and innovative questions, even if we don't do new and innovative things. Sometimes we need to, sometimes we don't.
Yeah. One of the things that I think about when it comes to our specific actions are the Old Testament deals with social justice. It's all over the prophets. And if we read the prophets more, then we'd have less of a problem with the social justice conversation. But even with that, most of the solution to the problem is the prophets, or come into the New Testament, it's similar of, you know what the right thing to do is? Go do the right things. Okay, well, that's very open-ended. It isn't, because it's the right, God's righteousness, but now it's, well, how do I do that now? And something with, our knowing people a little bit better, we might go, this belief is still true. This practice that the church did for all these, yeah, that may not work. Maybe it never worked, or it did work, but it doesn't work now. We need to do this because we know people a little bit better. And those
Yeah.
those are good questions and good things to figure out. From a for sake of time, we'll jump right into the next point here. We won't beat our record for the longest episode like we did in the last one. Okay, so we've gradually built towards, with a general kind of time frame now, things being collected, some reasons for we need to have an actual order and structure to this thing because people are bringing in all kinds of ideas about stuff. So then we start getting these actual lists from people all over the place. So where do we start? How does that stuff develop as we go through time here?
Yeah, so we've talked about this process, and I now want to dive into the actual process of how we landed on the 27 books in our New Testament. And this will illustrate the point that we've been making of kind of this was a process of development in the church. And I'll have some comments to make at the end of that. But you can start in the Eastern church, and the conversation in the Eastern church begins with Tatian in around AD 180, so the end of the second century. We get the Diatessaron, which means through the four, and is a harmony of the Gospels. And so he brings the Gospels together in a new and unique way by trying to harmonize them in the Diatessaron. We then have Clement of Alexandria, AD 120 to 215, so the second into the third century. And in his work, he cites all of the New Testament books, but James, 2nd Peter, and 3rd John, as well as some apocryphal writings. And so what we see with him is, he doesn't put together a list, but we see for Clement what the authoritative books were that he cites to make theological and spiritual points for the church. And he uses all of the New Testament books, like I said, but a few, James, 2nd Peter, 3rd John, as well as some apocryphal works. And then Origen, 185 to 254. So again, in the 2nd century into the 3rd century, but a little bit later than Clement, only expresses concern over James, 2nd Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John, very similar to Clement. Something that we'll see, and I'll make a comment on this at the end, is some of the same books are going to come into question by multiple authors at multiple periods of time throughout both Eastern and Western Christianity. So we move over to the West, and we see the usage of Scripture, which kind of fits into this same line as Clement and Origen, and I won't mention every book that all these people used just for the sake of time. But Justin Martyr, 100 to 165, Hippolytus of Rome, 170 to 235, Irenaeus, 170, 180, he does a lot of writing, Tertullian, 160 to 225, Cyprian of Carthage, 200 to 258. So the same kind of period in both East and West. So 2nd century into the 3rd century, we see people using and quoting from the majority of the New Testament. So I'll use Irenaeus as the example. He made full use of the New Testament, quoting all but Philemon, 2nd Peter again, 3rd John again, and Jude. He never quotes from or uses in any of his writings. So we begin to see 2nd century and 3rd century Christian authors and leaders utilizing particular books as authoritative. And that's kind of where this process begins of who these people believe are the authoritative writings. And it ends up being the majority of the New Testament, with the exception of a couple of books and some apocryphal writings. And in a future episode, we'll talk more about apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings. The first canon, so the first true list of books that we have, is the Muratorian canon, which dates anywhere from the late 2nd century at the earliest all the way into the 4th century. It is fragmentary, and so the list includes 21, but probably 23 originally, 21 or 23 books of the 27 New Testament books. Matthew and Mark are missing, but they're likely included in the missing fragment. So the first part is missing of the Muratorian canon, which likely had Matthew and Mark. And so it includes, I think we need to say 23 books, most likely, including Matthew and Mark. And it includes all of the Gospels, most of the New Testament, with the exception of Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, so there's 2nd Peter again, and 3rd John. It does include the apocryphal works, such as the Wisdom of Solomon and the Shepherd of Hermes. And this illustrates, once again, what we see with early writers and the first canons, like the Muratorian canon, is that most of the books of the New Testament are there. Some apocryphal writings are there, and some are shared between all of them. And then there are a couple of books, like a 2nd Peter, like a 3rd John, maybe a Jude, maybe a Hebrews, maybe a Revelation, who are either not included and not cited. And so from silence, we can't just assume, well, they completely rejected those, but we can say they don't use them authoritatively, which is significant. Now, it's hard to argue from silence, but it is significant. And these early canons where people start listing things out, it's interesting. We see the same types of things, the same types of books excluded that are not used by earlier authors. We then move on from the Muratorian canon to Eusebius's ecclesiastical history. Eusebius was bishop of Caesarea in Palestine from 314 to 339, so the beginning part of the 4th century. And Eusebius distinguishes 3 categories of New Testament books. Universally acknowledged, which is most of the books that are acknowledged by the people that come before Eusebius. So the Gospels, most of Paul's letters, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Thessalonians, in essence, the undisputed letters of Paul today. He has a category of disputed, which are the general or Catholic epistles. So James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, some of those books fall into this disputed category, which again fits with what comes before Eusebius. So he's not departing very much from those who come before. And then he had a list of spurious letters, which included Revelation. So Eusebius kind of rejected Revelation as not equal to the universally acknowledged or the disputed books. But again, what's important, I think, for us is to see that Eusebius not just makes these categories or these buckets to kind of drop books in, but he seems to be correct because it fits the other evidence that we have that precedes him. So some of the church fathers and the Muratorian canon. One of the next important things is Athanasius's 39th Paschal letter. And this is the first time that we get a list of books that includes the 27 books of the New Testament as we have them today. They are not in the traditional order, though, but Athanasius is the first one to list the 27 books of our New Testament as the authoritative canon books. Now, the important thing to understand is Athanasius does not speak for all Christians. He only speaks for those over whom he is bishop. And so for those under his direction, these were going to be the New Testament books that were considered authoritative. And this process comes to an end at the Council of Carthage in 397, so the very end of the 4th century, almost to the beginning of the 5th century. And that's where the year 400 earlier came into play. The Council of Carthage agrees upon the same list that Athanasius included in his 39th Paschal letter, which, by the way, his letter was not trying to identify authoritative books. It was a letter instructing churches on practices for Easter. And he includes a list of books in there. The Council of Carthage in 397 agrees on the same books. And that becomes, from that point forward, kind of authoritative for Orthodox Christianity of these are New Testament books. Now, a couple of things that are important there is what I want you to see is this is a process of recognition within the church as a whole. The church globally, over time, different people in different places at different times are recognizing certain books as authoritative, as canon. And there are certain books that are considered authoritative from the very beginning. Undisputed letters of Paul, the Gospels, are considered authoritative from the very beginning. And so this is a process that over time, the church begins to recognize certain books as being authoritative. And this process of recognition climaxes with the Council of Carthage in 397, where they are not choosing amongst all these books what's going to be authoritative, but what they're doing is they're recognizing the books that over this period of time, over the first 400 years of the church's existence, have come to be recognized as authoritative. And I'll have more to say on that as we close by talking about some of the major principles in this process. But I also want you to notice that there were certain books that took a long time to be recognized, and they're for reasons that are understandable. So Hebrews, because there's no author listed, that makes sense of it took a little longer for churches to recognize Hebrews. 2nd John, 3rd John, sometimes 2nd Peter, sometimes Jude. These are books that are either short. So you think of like 2nd and 3rd John, very, very short. They don't have much to say. These are books that a lot of the time author is uncertain or how they connect to. So like 2nd and 3rd John are the elder. Well, who is the elder. And so questions of authorship, questions of length. Then you have something like Revelation, which even today we read and we recognize, well, this is very different.
Hmm.
And so Revelation was just so different that it took a while to be accepted. So we can begin to understand why some books took longer than others. The majority of books were there from the beginning. Some of these other ones that are different, or they're shorter, or authorship is unknown, it kind of takes some time to be recognized within the church. But that's kind of the general process of the usage and then the naming and then kind of the culmination in Carthage of the recognition of our 27 New Testament books.
Yeah, so I was gonna ask about the ones that kept coming up because I really like Second Peter, so I'm glad that I'm glad that that one's okay. Allegedly, anyway, it's okay with everybody else. Um, yeah, so I was gonna ask about that, but I what I hope this shows is because that's the comment I was making at the beginning. A lot of people who just have the like quick internet search part will go to guys at the Council of Carthage decided these are the books, these are not the books, and here you go, and you miss all of these hundreds of years of history where they're compiling and already having these conversations, and this guy over here has these and this guy over here has those books, and maybe there's one or two that are missing or a few more that are in, but they're all aggregating this stuff over time here, and then eventually you get to this point of, well, let's what has history up to this point said? Well, it looks like it's about these 27 New Testament books right here. But there's a whole process to get to that point. It's just not some people a long time later making a judgment based on their own feelings at the time. It was a lot more involved than that. We have at the very end here, and I didn't actually ask you, um, because it's just three questions here. Major principles. Are these major principles that they went by to determine these things? Is that the idea? Okay. So walk us through those three questions.
So there's three major principles that the church used in this process of recognizing what books are authoritative. Now, here's something important is that people were not sitting down with a checklist saying, okay, I've got this letter to the Romans. Does it meet all of these criteria? That's not what. And I've heard people kind of present that of, well, these were the criteria, and it almost comes across like there was this checklist that
Hmm.
ancient Christians were. That's just not the. But these seem to be some of the guiding thoughts that guide this development to the recognition of the 27 books that we have. Not a checklist, not that everybody thought about all of these, but these seem to be kind of principles that kind of guided this process. So the first is who wrote the book. So connecting it to an apostle to make it authoritative was important. And that's why we talked about, when we were talking about authorship of the Gospels, of, well, why does Matthew become connected with Matthew or John connected with John? Well, because this was important to present a work as authoritative. Well, how do you know that this work is true? Well, it was written or connected to someone who was an apostle. That's why it's believed that Mark wrote the gospel according to Peter, or that Luke wrote the gospel according to Paul, or people wanted to connect it to an authority, particularly an apostle, which is also why books like 2nd and 3rd John and Hebrews and Jude become books that take a while to make it in, because there was not as much of a connection between those books and an apostle. And it was important for most Christians who wrote it. So the first is who wrote it. The second, what is the message of the book? And this is kind of obvious. So as the church is dealing with heresies, as they're developing their own theology, as the church is coming to recognize what is orthodox, so right, correct teaching, what do we believe? The books that went out are books that support orthodoxy. Now, that might be a discussion for another day on Is the orthodoxy that one actual orthodoxy? Why did certain other beliefs not win out, and therefore books that support them not win out? That's kind of beyond the scope of this discussion. But the books that end up winning out, again, not as Jack said, it's not a vote of people getting together in a secret meeting and choosing the books that they want. As we saw, it's this process of recognizing books. The majority of the books were recognized from the very beginning. So the part of what do the books teach is, what do these books line up with the teachings in the books that have been accepted pretty much since the very beginning? So do they line up with what Paul says? Do they line up with what the four gospels say? But there is kind of this process of the books that went out are the books that support what the church comes to recognize as orthodoxy or correct teaching. And then the final one was, how well were these books received? And to me, this is more of a, I don't know of any evidence of someone sitting around of, well, how many churches accepted these books? But again, with the process of how do we come to 400 years later still have copies of the letters of Paul? Well, it's because they are widely used, widely circulated, and the church keeps them because they are important to a lot of churches in a lot of different places. And so what the Council of Carthage does is, they're not choosing the books, but they're recognizing what has happened during this process. That over the course of 400 years, Christians have copied and gathered and collected writings that they have considered authoritative. Not every group, not every person had the same books, but a lot of them were the same among most people from early on. And as this process is happening, and as heresy kind of stems the need to kind of start to make some lists, the things going on in the minds of a lot of people are, who wrote this? So they're drawn to books that are connected to an apostle. They're drawn to books that support the theologies and the beliefs that end up winning out and being considered orthodox among the early church. And then as this process happens, the books that are gathered together and rise to the surface tend to be the books that the majority of Christians are using and copying and sharing. And so the Council of Carthage comes not to choose the books, but kind of to recognize this process that's happened.
Mhm.
And it's an organic process, and that's what I want people to understand, was it's not a process of anyone kind of picking and choosing and discarding and having a list of criteria. That's not what happened. It's kind of this organic process in the church where these questions are being considered and different people are pulling together different books, and it all kind of comes together and culminates at the Council of Carthage, that is simply kind of recognizing this process that has been taking place. And you and I, who believe in the work of the Spirit, there's some faith, I think, that comes into this, of believing that the Spirit's at work in this process in some way. I mean, we may not know exactly, but somehow the Spirit's at work in this process, and we have the faith to say that we have the books that God wants us to have, and we don't have the books that God doesn't want us to have.
Yeah, yeah. I meant to say this with the last point, because I don't think I can wrap it up any different than that, so I won't. But I did want to bring this up. There's an app called Catena. It's Catena, and I bring that up because it's Old Testament, New Testament. But you can click on whatever verse, and not every verse has this. But when you click on the verse, it will give you the church father or whoever. Like, I clicked on Exodus 15:11, and it brings up John Chrysostom quoted this in AD 407. Here's the context he used it in, which is just kind of fascinating, going along with this of seeing these different individuals using this book, quoting that one, quoting this, bringing these pieces in, because it shows you a little bit of what we talked about today of, well, he views this one as authoritative and they view this one as authoritative, and it goes back uh, all over as far as time frame goes. But if you're interested in looking a little more at this, that's a good little resource to use to kind of go, oh, that's interesting. People were quoting from this for a long time in sermons, lessons, whatever it may be. This does it for our episode today on how the books were chosen, on the New Testament books, I should say. Maybe I don't know if we I don't know if you want to do an Old Testament one, but if you flood Spencer's inbox with requests to do Old Testament canon, I bet that that's something that we can look into as well. A little bit different of a process there, an interesting conversation, but I think we have a little bit more coming in the vein of this particular conversation. But we've looked at gospel authorship, we've looked at why they wrote these things in the first place, and now spent this time looking at the books that we have, and having a little bit more confidence, I think, in how they came together alongside our faith here, and how they came together, and why we ought to study and read these things and appreciate that process all the more. That does it for our episode today. I'm Jack. That's Spencer. We'll see you next time.